Long before anyone in the country said his name, Adam Foster measured his life in loaves that were almost right and loaves that were exactly right, and the gap between the two was the only thing he truly understood. At Howard Foods he ran quality control across a factory floor as wide as 2 football fields, walking the line before daylight while the ovens still sat cold, tasting and weighing and turning back entire runs when a crust surfaced a half shade too pale. The older men on the line called him careful. The younger ones, impatient and half asleep, called him slow. He took both words the same way, with a short nod and a quiet refusal to bend, because he had understood since boyhood that being trustworthy was the one form of wealth he could hold on to. He was 35. Each morning he pulled himself up in a rented house at the edge of town, brewed coffee he almost never finished, and drove to a job he performed cleanly and felt nothing for. Whatever he loved was buried beneath all of it, tucked out of sight like a recipe card he no longer trusted himself to read. Years back he had wanted to cook. More than that, foolishly, he had wanted a bakery of his own, an actual storefront with his name lettered on the window and his own bread stacked warm behind the glass. He had confided this to nearly no one. A wish spoken aloud can be mocked, a silent one cannot, and Adam had guarded his a very long time. The person at Howard Foods best equipped to do the mocking, when mocking was called for, was Vivian Marsh. She had inherited the top of the company far younger than expected, and carried that youth the way some people carry a scar, half warning and half challenge. To Vivian, a company was a spreadsheet that had learned to breathe, and each name inside it was a figure that was either rising or falling. She was no theatrical villain, which would have been easier. She could end a man's income in the seconds it took to shut a laptop, do it without lifting her voice, and walk away genuinely believing the calm of it had been a kind of fairness. For 3 years Adam worked under her without ever once being seen by her. On her reports he was a single row marked quality assurance, dependable and shaded green, and green rows do not demand a second glance. He was content with that. He arrived earlier than his shift required and stayed past what his pay covered, and he assumed in the honest math of a decent man that this record of loyalty was being tallied somewhere that it registered, that it would shield him if a day ever arrived when he needed shielding. That assumption was the costliest thing he owned, and he did not yet know he owned it. The bill came due with a phone call at 4 in the morning, the kind that rings in a different register than every other call you have ever received. His mother, Helen, had gone down in her kitchen. She lived 40 minutes off by herself in the same house Adam had been raised in, and she had raised him there alone through years so thin that even now he could not scrape bread into a bin without a small twist of guilt. Now the woman who had done without so that her son never had to was flat on a hospital bed, with lines running into her arm, and a chart crowded with words he could not say out loud. The doctors leaned on the slow, padded phrasing people reach for when they are readying you for the worst without committing to it. Adam did not spare a thought for Howard Foods inside that room. The thought found him later, out in the corridor, a paper cup of coffee cooling, forgotten in his fist, when it landed on him that he would need time. Not a great deal of it. A few days, enough to get her moved, to corner the specialists, to sit beside her so she would not wake frightened and by herself. He rang the office before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, left a message laying out plainly what had happened, and asked for a brief leave he had every reason to believe he had earned. 3 days on, he drove in to handle the paperwork the right way, still unshaven, still balanced on the knife's edge of no sleep, and was told the meeting he had booked had been relocated. Relocated, it turned out, to the open floor, in front of the shift managers, in front of the very people he had taught and corrected and quietly covered for across the years. Vivian stood waiting with a folder she had no need to open, because she already knew every line inside it. She announced in front of all of them that his disappearance had cost the department a critical audit window. She laid down the word reliability, the way a person sets down something heavy on a table. A man who vanished the instant the work grew hard, she said, was not a man a company could be built around. Adam started to explain about his mother, the hospital, the message he had left. Vivian raised a single hand, not sharply. only enough, and told him that everyone always had a reason and that reasons did not run a business. "We need people who show up," she said. "You didn't." He stood in the flat wash of the fluorescence while she thanked him for his years of service in roughly the tone one uses to turn down a lunch invitation. And it came clear to him, standing there, that the ledger he had banked on, the private accounting of every dark morning and unpaid hour, had never lived anywhere but inside his own head. No report carried a line for the mornings he had beaten the ovens in. There was only the window he had missed, and the woman who had ruled him a liability, and the loose ring of familiar faces studying their own shoes because they had nowhere better to look. He did not raise his voice. It was not exactly pride. It was that his voice would not have carried the weight. He surrendered his badge, said something low that nobody quite caught, and walked out through a door he had passed through better than 2,000 times. The instant it swung shut at his back, he stopped being a man with a career and became a man with a problem. The weeks that followed were ones he would never describe to anyone, not even when describing them might have brought him some sympathy. His mother's care did not come cheap, and the savings he had assembled one careful check at a time began bleeding out in a way that finally taught him why his own mother had always winced at wasted bread. He mailed applications. He sat in waiting rooms opposite men who held his resume and wore a certain look while they read it. And he learned that in a town this small, word moves faster than truth. And the word on Adam Foster was that he had abandoned a good job at the exact moment it mattered. Whether that was accurate did not signify. The shape of the story had already set like cooling sugar. He had very nearly made his peace with it, with the long, grinding climb back, with explaining himself across interview after interview to people who had already made up their minds. What stopped him was not ambition. It was an aimless Tuesday and a drive he took for no reason beyond the need to keep moving. And a building on the wrong end of Fuller Street, with butcher paper taped across its windows and a sign in the door lettered in a hand already going faint, announcing that the place was shutting for good. It had been a bakery once. He could make out its ghost through the glass, the long emptied cases, the dead ovens ranked along the rear wall. The tile floor scuffed pale in a single track where somebody had stood for years doing the one thing Adam had always wanted to do. He stayed planted on that sidewalk far longer than a level-headed man would have, and the wish he had folded away and never once said aloud began quietly to come unfolded. He knew every argument against it. He was out of work, his mother was sick, and his savings had shrunk to a sliver that was the only thing standing between him and real trouble. Buying a dying bakery at the precise hour his life had come apart was not a plan. It was the exact inverse of a plan. Any honest advisor would have told him to hold on to the money, take the first dependable job that surfaced, and leave the wish folded where it could do him no harm. He dialed the number on the sign that same afternoon. The woman who picked up sounded worn in the way people sound when they have already mourned a thing before it is even lost. Her name was Ruth Callan, and she had kept the place running a long time, and when he met her the following morning, her hands wore the permanent flower-white lines of someone who had long ago stopped noticing them. She led him through the building with a flashlight, half the fixtures having died. She showed him the oven that still ran and the pair that no longer did. She did not dress it up, telling him flatly what was broken and what would break next. Then she stood in the center of the bare floor and admitted she had hoped it would land with someone who grasped what it had been. "It's not a good investment," she said. "I won't pretend it is. But it was a good bakery. Those aren't the same thing, and most people can't tell them apart." Adam told her he could tell them apart. Saying it, he realized it was the truest sentence he had spoken in weeks. He took the money still left to him, the savings meant to be a wall between his mother and catastrophe, and laid down nearly all of it. He ran the arithmetic a dozen times over, and not once did it come out comforting. He signed in a lawyer's office that smelled of stale coffee, and when it was finished, he sat in his truck with both hands on the wheel and did not drive off for a long stretch, because he had just wagered the last firm ground under his feet on a move every person in his life would have begged him not to make. He drove to the hospital that evening and told his mother. He had not meant to. His intention had been to spare her, to let her believe he had turned up something steady, since the last thing a sick woman needs is a fresh reason to fret over the son who is supposed to be fretting over her. But she looked up at him across the pale sheets and asked him what he had done, because a mother reads her son's face the way Adam read a crust, and he found he could not put a lie in front of her. He told her about Fuller Street. He told her the number, the real one, and watched her run the same math he had run and arrive at the same frightening sum. He braced for her to tell him he had lost his mind. He would not have argued. Some part of him wanted her to, so that at least one person would say the fear out loud. Instead, Helen went quiet for a while, her thin hand resting on the blanket, and then she put to him a single question. She asked whether, if the whole thing collapsed, he would be able to live with knowing he had tried. Adam thought about the door at Howard Foods, and the sound it had made closing, and the years of green rose that had counted for exactly nothing, and the folded card he had been too afraid to read for far too long. "If I fail," he said slowly, "at least I'll have failed at my own thing, not somebody else's." His mother let her eyes fall shut, and something in her face loosened, and she told him that was the only kind of failure worth the risk. She had spent her whole life failing at other people's things. She said at jobs that used her up and then let her go. And if she carried one regret, it was that she had never once been brave enough to fail at something that belonged to her. She told him to go and build it. She told him she fully intended to be well enough to taste it. He returned to Fuller Street the next morning with a box of tools and no clear notion of where to begin, which is the honest starting condition of everyone who has ever begun a thing that mattered. He stripped the butcher paper off the windows with his own hands, and daylight poured into that dead room for the first time in months, and it fell across the pale, worn track in the tile where Ruth had stood for 30 years. And it settled on Adam that he was standing precisely where he was meant to stand, at the head of a road he had chosen instead of one chosen for him. He had no customers. He had a failing building, an emptying account, a mother in a hospital bed, and a name around town that pointed the exact opposite direction from everything he was about to attempt. By every yardstick Vivian Marsh would have recognized, by every figure on every report, Adam Foster was a man who had just made the worst decision of his life. He pushed his sleeves up, found the one oven that still lit, and set about learning how to be right. Not almost right, exactly right, at the only thing he had ever genuinely wanted to do. The first month came close to breaking him, and it did the breaking quietly, the way real hardship tends to show up, with no drama at all, only a patient pile-up of things going wrong. The bakery on Fuller Street had been dying longer than its sign let on, and every morning turned up a new symptom of that long decline. The proofing cabinet would hold no heat. The second oven's thermostat lied by 40 degrees in whichever direction suited its mood. A pipe beneath the sink wept a slow brown stain across the floor, and the front door hung just crooked enough to scrape its frame and flag every arrival with a sound like a grievance. He fixed what he could with his own 2 hands, because he could no longer afford anyone else's. The savings that had once been a wall between his mother and disaster were now a thin sheaf of bills. He counted more often than was good for him, and every repair came straight out of it. He taught himself to solder, learned which parts could be salvaged and which had to be swapped, and learned to do the swapping at 2 in the morning, once the baking was done and the town had gone dark, when there was nobody to watch a former quality manager on his back under a leaking sink. He held to a schedule that would have alarmed the very men who had once called him careful. He was inside the bakery by 3, mixing and shaping in the cold before the lone working oven crept up to temperature. He baked through the sunrise, sold through the daylight, cleaned through the evening, repaired through the night, and in the seams between it all drove to the hospital to sit with Helen and let the steadiness on his face convince her that things were running better than they were. She was not convinced, but she let him keep the pretense because it was the only rest her son was getting anywhere. The town did not make it any easier. Word had already settled on who Adam Foster was, and word does not revise itself to suit anyone's convenience. People who had heard he walked off the job at Howard Foods now heard he had poured his last dollar into the Fuller Street bakery. And the two facts sat side by side in their heads and fused into a single verdict, which was that the man's judgment simply could not be trusted. They said it the way people say such things in a small place, never to his face, but always shaped to reach him. A bakery that had failed under an owner who knew what she was doing, the thinking went, was hardly going to be rescued by a jobless man with something to prove. He heard the doubt in the bell above the door, which is to say he heard it in the long stretches of silence when the bell did not ring at all. There were mornings he baked 40 loaves and sold 6. There were afternoons when the only sound in the whole place was the tick of the cooling racks and the fall of his own footsteps along the worn tile, pacing the same track Ruth had worn before him. And on those afternoons the arithmetic in his head grew loud and precise and cruel, and he had to hold still and remind himself of the one question his mother had asked and the answer he had given back. What rescued him in the end was not a strategy, it was the bread. Through those punishing weeks he had been doing the only thing he had ever truly known how to do, which was to insist on the line between almost right and exactly right. And he had turned that insistence loose on his own recipes with a focus that shaded into obsession. He tested flours until his hands could pick out the good ones by touch alone. He learned the exact hour a dough wanted shaping and the exact minute it wanted to leave the heat, and he threw out everything merely good in his hunt for the thing that was correct. He was not a trained baker. He was something the trained ones so often quit being, a man who cared about every single loaf as though it were the only one he would ever make. The first customers who drifted in out of curiosity, half expecting to confirm what the town had already decided, found instead a crust that shattered the way a crust is meant to, and a crumb that tasted like something remembered rather than something bought. They came back the next day, and they brought somebody with them. That was how it started, not with a surge, but with a rumor that at last began running the other direction, one honest mouth at a time. Ruth Callan turned out to be among his first regulars, which caught him off guard, since he had assumed the woman who sold him the place would want to forget the place existed. Instead, she came in twice a week, took the small stool at the counter by the window, and told him the plain truth about whatever she tasted, which was the single most valuable thing anyone handed him in those months. She told him when a batch was sentimental instead of good. One grey morning she told him he had managed something with the old shop that she never had, and that she had not expected to be glad about it, and was. By the opening of the second month, the mornings that had once moved 6 loaves were moving 30, and the bell above the crooked door had begun to ring in a way that no longer felt rare. It was not success. It was survival with the faint outline of a future traced inside it, which for a man in Adam's position was very nearly the same thing as hope. Vivian Marsh came through the door on an unremarkable Thursday, and she recognized neither the shop nor the man standing in it, because she had never in her life truly looked at either. She had come out to the district on one of the market surveys she ran herself, trusting no one else to read a neighborhood the way she believed she could read a spreadsheet. She had parked on Fuller Street by pure accident, spotted a bakery with a modest little line at the counter, and stepped inside out of a reflex to inspect anything that appeared to be working. She was clocking the foot traffic, the price board, the small economies of the room, when the man behind the counter lifted his head, and her expression slid from cool appraisal into something colder and more pleased. "So this is where people wind up," she said, laughing thinly, "when they can't hold down a real job." It was the same laugh she had used out on the open floor at Harrowan Foods, the kind that needs an audience to be complete. Adam knew her at once, and something in his chest pulled tight and then went perfectly still. He had on an apron, white with flour, his sleeves shoved up, his hands dusted to the wrist, and in one clean instant he understood exactly what she was seeing and exactly what she had concluded it meant. She ran her eyes over him the way a person studies a cautionary tale that has helpfully arranged itself for inspection. She supposed aloud that everyone had to land somewhere, and that it was almost fitting, really, that a man who couldn't keep the job she had handed him had found work baking for somebody else. She said it was good that he'd found something, in the tone people reserve for meaning the reverse. She was certain, in the way she was certain of nearly everything, that she was reading the last page of Adam Foster's story, and that the page was a small and faintly pitiable one. Adam did not correct her. The urge was right there, sharp and immediate, to tell her the name on the lease was his, that the bread she stood beside was his, that the small line of people at her back had come for something he had shaped with his own hands and not for a paycheck anyone had handed him. He held the urge and let it pass. He had spent years being defined by what others decided he was, and had learned across these 2 months that the surest way to lose was to argue with a conclusion rather than outlast it. So he served her. He asked, in the level voice he used with every customer, what she would like. When she said she was only looking, he nodded and told her she was welcome to look as long as she pleased. He rapped an order for the woman standing behind her. He wiped the counter down. He treated Vivian Marsh exactly as he treated every soul who came through his door, with a plain, unbothered courtesy that handed her nothing to shove against. And the absence of anything to shove against seemed to unsettle her more than any defense could have. She lingered a beat, longer than she needed to, as if waiting for him to argue his case, to show her the wound she assumed she had left in him. When he did none of it, she gave a small, satisfied shake of the head shake of someone confirming a theory, and left the way she had come. Sure, she had just witnessed a man at the floor of his descent. The bell over the crooked door rang behind her, and Adam released a breath he had not known he was holding, and turned back to his oven and said nothing to anyone. The trouble with outlasting a conclusion is that you rarely learn the moment it finally cracks. Adam had no idea that Vivian walked off Fuller Street believing she had watched him lose, and he had no idea that the very quality that let him serve her without a single word was the quality about to overturn everything. Marcus Reed came in 11 days after her, and unlike Vivian he was looking, genuinely looking, because looking was his trade. He produced a food program that crossed the country hunting the small places that did one thing extraordinarily well. The family counters and corner ovens the guidebooks skated past. He had a palate that had spoiled most restaurants for him, and a stubborn faith that somewhere out past the highways the real thing was still being made by hand. He had heard about Fuller Street the way everyone was hearing about it now, from a person who knew a person, and he had driven 40 minutes on a rumor, because rumors were his entire livelihood. He ordered without ceremony and ate standing near the window, and Adam watched him from behind the counter the way he watched every new face, without expectation, because expectation was a luxury he could not currently afford. Marcus took one bite and stopped. He turned the crust over in his hand as though it had just said something to him. He asked who the baker was, and when Adam said he was, Marcus asked where he had trained. Adam told him the truth, which was nowhere, which was that he had spent 11 years telling other people when their bread was wrong before he ever learned to make it right himself. Marcus Reed did not bother hiding his astonishment, and he was not a man much given to it. He told Adam that in 15 years of driving down county roads on the word of strangers he had tasted a great deal of good bread and a very small quantity of the other thing, the thing that cannot be taught, and that he was tasting the other thing right now. He said he wanted Adam on the program, not as a throwaway segment, not as a local color curiosity, but as one of the featured artisan bakeries in an episode that would air across the country, and he spelled out what that exposure had done for places smaller and far less remarkable than this one. Adam stood dead still behind his counter and understood that a door was swinging open, a different sort of door than the one that had shut on him at Howard Foods, and that this one he was being invited through on the strength of the only thing he had ever wanted to be measured by. He said yes before his fear could talk him out of it. Marcus handed him a date, a little under 2 weeks off, and told him the crew would film him working, film the bread, and let the food carry the story, because the food, he said, was the story. In the days that followed, the rumor about Fuller Street grew a second layer, and word reached Vivian, the way word always reached her, filtered and second-hand and bent by whatever assumptions the carrier brought along. She heard the little bakery she had stumbled into was drawing notice. She heard, somewhere in the telling, that Adam Foster had a hand in it, and she pressed this new fact into the old mold of her verdict, because minds like hers do not give up a verdict without a fight. A desperate man had taken a menial job at a bakery, and the bakery was catching a moment of attention, and that was the entire story. It revised nothing about the man. She was confident, still right about him, and being right was the thing she guarded above all else. Then, with 4 days left before the cameras arrived, everything Adam had built began coming apart at once. The failing second oven, the one he had nursed through 2 months on solder and patience, died at last in a way no repair would touch, and it died on a night when he needed every square inch of oven space to be ready for a national crew. He stood in front of it at 1 in the morning with a flashlight clenched in his teeth and his hands black with grease, and understood that a new oven cost more than he held, that the money he did hold was already spoken for by his mother's care, and that he was staring down a choice no man should have to make, 4 days out from the largest chance of his life. Morning brought the second blow. His flour supplier, the one whose particular grind he had spent weeks learning by feel, called to say the delivery he had built the entire shoot around would arrive late. Badly late. Possibly not until after the crew had come and gone. Everything Adam had planned to bake, the loaves that had earned him the invitation in the first place, depended on ingredients, now riding a truck somewhere far from Fuller Street, with no promise of turning up in time. He sat down on an upturned crate in the middle of his silent bakery in the grey light, before the town had woken, and for the first time since he had torn the butcher paper off the windows. He felt the full weight of how far he had reached and how little was holding him up. The oven was dead, the flour was gone, his savings were already assigned, and the one chance to prove to the town, to himself, and to a woman who had ruled him finished, that he had never been finished at all, was 4 days off and dissolving in his hands. He thought about the door at Howard Foods and the sound it had made. He thought about his mother's question, whether he could live with having tried. And he understood, sitting on that crate with the light coming up over Fuller Street, that he was about to find out precisely what that answer was worth. Everything he had wagered was on the table, and for one long grey morning it looked as though he was going to lose all of it. He did not let himself sit on the crate for long, because grief and arithmetic were both luxuries that 4 days could not spare. What he had in their place was the one thing these 2 months had drilled into him, how to be exactly right under pressure, and he set to solving the disaster in the order it could be solved. The dead oven he could not raise, and there was no money to replace it, so he stopped reaching for a new one and worked with what he had. He did the harder math of what the single oven that had carried him could turn out if the man running it went without sleep. It meant staggering the whole bake through the night in careful waves, one batch cooling while the next proofed, a schedule so tight it left no room for a mistake. He would have to be flawless for 4 days on almost no rest. He had been flawless on no rest before. He knew the shape of it. The flour was the crueler problem, because no quantity of willpower bakes bread out of ingredients stranded on a late truck. He called the supplier back and did not raise his voice, since raising his voice had never once solved anything, and instead asked plainly whether any portion of the order, any partial load, could reach Fuller Street before the crew did. He was told a smaller quantity might be available out of a nearer warehouse, not the full grind he had built his plan on, but something close enough that a man who knew flour by feel might make it work. Close enough was not a phrase Adam had ever once accepted across 11 years of quality control. But these 2 months had taught him a second lesson. Insisting on perfection is worthless if it leaves you holding nothing at all. And a great baker is not the man who demands ideal conditions, but the one who finds what is right, hidden inside what is barely adequate. He took the partial load. He drove out to the nearer warehouse himself, hauled the sacks into his truck by hand, and carried them back to Fuller Street in the dark. Then he did the thing that set him apart from the man he had been at Howard Foods. He put his hands into the new flour and learned it, mixing small test batches through the small hours, adjusting the water by feel reading the dough the way Ruth had once read him across the empty floor, chasing the right result through a substitute he had never intended to touch. It cost him most of a night and a great deal of flour he could barely spare, but somewhere before the third dawn he found it, the hydration and the timing that coaxed the lesser grind into behaving like the loaf that had earned him the invitation. He barely slept in the days that came after. Ruth Callan arrived on the second morning, took in the dead oven, the grease still ground into his hands, the hollowness wringing his eyes, and without being asked, she took over the front counter so that Adam could stay at the bench. She did not offer sympathy, which he could not have afforded to accept. She offered work, the only sort of help that was any use to him just then, and the two of them ran the little bakery through the most important week of its life, the way it had always been run by a hand without any margin, on the stubborn belief that doing the thing correctly still counted for something. The morning the crew rolled in, Adam had been awake for the better part of 2 days, and the bakery smelled the way he had spent 2 months teaching it to smell. Marcus Reed came in ahead of his cameras, looked over the racks of finished loaves cooling in the grey light, and had no idea, because Adam never told him, that 4 days earlier the whole thing had nearly collapsed. He knew nothing of the dead oven, or the late truck, or the flour learned by feel in the dark. He saw only the bread, and the bread was exactly right. And the bread was the story, precisely as he had promised. They filmed Adam working, his hands buried in the dough, his sleeves shoved up, and his forearms white to the elbow, and they filmed a crust breaking the way a good crust should break. And Marcus put to him, on camera, the same question he had asked in private, where a man learns to bake like this. Adam gave the same answer, which was nowhere, which was that he had spent 11 years learning the difference between good and right before he ever found the nerve to make anything himself. It was not a polished answer. It was a true one, and the camera, which forgives almost nothing, forgave it entirely. The segment aired 3 weeks on a Friday night, and it was not long, no more than a few minutes lodged inside a larger episode. But it did the thing Marcus had spent 15 years driving down county roads in search of. It found the quality that cannot be taught and set it in front of the whole country at once. It showed a man with flour on his hands and no training and no safety net, making bread that a professional palate had driven 40 minutes on a rumour to taste. And underneath the food it told the older and simpler story of a person who had lost everything and refused to stop. The response did not gather slowly the way the town's trust had. It landed all at once, overnight, the way only a national broadcast can deliver. By the next morning a line ran outside the crooked door and down the block, people who had watched a few minutes of television and driven in from 3 counties over to taste it for themselves. Adam sold out of everything he had by 9 and baked in a fury to sell out again by noon. The bell above the door, which had once gone silent for whole afternoons at a stretch, now rang so relentlessly that he stopped hearing it as a sound and started hearing it as weather. The town that had decided who Adam Foster was revised its verdict the way towns do, fast and without ever admitting it had held the other opinion. The man who had sunk his last dollar into a dying bakery was now the man who had put Fuller Street on the map, and the same mouths that had doubted him now announced, cheerfully and without a flicker of irony, that they had always known there was something special about that place. Adam let them have it. He had learned that outlasting a conclusion meant letting people rewrite their own memories, and that arguing with the rewrite was every bit as pointless as arguing with the original had been. Vivian Marsh caught the segment by accident, the way most turning points arrive. She was in her apartment on a Friday night with the television running for company, half working, half attending, when the food program cut to a small bakery she recognized before she understood why. Then the camera found the man behind the counter, sleeves shoved up, hands white with flour, and she went very still. It was the same apron, the same man she had stepped around on Fuller Street, the one she had decided was baking for somebody else, the one whose defeat she had been so sure she had witnessed. And then the program said his name. It named him not as an employee but as the owner, the baker, the man who had made the very thing the whole country was now being told to want. She sat through the rest of the segment without moving. She heard him say he had trained nowhere. She heard him say he had spent 11 years telling other people when their work was wrong before he ever made anything of his own. And it came clear to her with a slow and unpleasant sharpness that those 11 years had partly unfolded at her company on her floor, where the man had been reduced to a green row on a report she had never once read closely. She had held the whole ledger of Adam Foster in her hands and seen nothing but a mist-ordered window and thrown the rest away without ever learning what it contained. What reached her was not that he had succeeded. Vivian respected success. It was the only language she had ever spoken fluently. What reached her was that she had been wrong, specifically and publicly, in a way she could not spreadsheet her way clear of. She had fired a man for tending his dying mother and called it reliability. She had stood inside his bakery and laughed at him over a job he did not have, over a defeat he was not experiencing. And he had served her without a word and let her walk out, still believing every bit of it. He had not needed to correct her. The truth had simply outlasted her, exactly as he must have known it would. She went back to Fuller Street on a weekday morning, deliberately early, ahead of the worst of the line. She stood across the street longer than she would ever have admitted, watching people carry white paper bags out of a door she had once swept out of in triumph, and then she made herself cross over and go in. The bell rang above her, the way it now rang above everyone. Adam looked up from the counter, and he knew her, and whatever he felt did not surface, because he had spent a long time learning not to let it. She did not open with an excuse, which for Vivian Marsh was an extraordinary act of restraint. She said his name first, only his name, and then she told him she had seen the program. She said she had come to say something she should have said months earlier and had been too certain of herself to say. She told him she had been wrong to fire him the way she had in front of everyone, without ever letting him explain about his mother, and that calling it reliability had been a way of dodging what it actually was, a decision made by someone who had stopped seeing the people on her own floor as people at all. "I owed you an apology a long time ago," she said. "I'm sorry for how I did it and for what I decided you were, and for standing in this room laughing at a man who'd built something I could never have built." Adam let the apology land before he answered it, not out of any staged hesitation, but because it deserved to be received rather than waved off. He told her evenly that he accepted it. He meant it. He was not a man who collected grievances, and he had hauled enough weight through the last months without adding hers. But he did not let her leave holding the tidy story. She seemed to want the redemptive version, the one where her cruelty had turned out, by accident, to be a gift. He told her plainly that his success had not come from being fired. Losing his job had not been a favor, and had not been a hidden blessing. It had nearly destroyed both him and his mother, and if the lesson she meant to carry out of this was that her decision had done him some good, then she had learned the wrong lesson all over again. What had built this bakery, he said, was not the door she had closed. It was that he had refused to stop after she closed it. The credit for that belonged to him, and to a sick woman who had told him from a hospital bed that the only failure worth risking is failing at your own thing. Vivian took that the way a person takes a truth they cannot argue with, quietly, with a changed face. She had come in half, expecting to be told that everything had worked out, that the ending justified the middle. Instead, she was told that the ending had been won, in spite of her one sleepless night at a time, by a man she had written off, and that no broadcast and no line down the block could turn what she had done into anything other than what it was. She did not defend herself for once, but only listened. She bought a loaf before she left, and she paid for it like everyone else, and the bell rang above her as she stepped out into the ordinary morning. And this time she did not shake her head at any theory, because the theory she had walked in carrying was gone. The change in Vivian did not announce itself, because real change rarely does. She went back to her company and to the floor she had never actually walked, and she began, slowly, against every habit she had built a career on, to read the reports differently. She started asking who the green rows were. She learned the names attached to the figures and the circumstances behind the absences. And when a man came to her one afternoon needing a few days for a family emergency, she recognized the shape of the moment she had gotten catastrophically wrong once before, and she did not get it wrong the second time. She never told anyone why. Some lessons a person keeps to themselves and pays off quietly across the rest of a working life. The bakery on Fuller Street did not fade after its overnight moment, the way such moments so often fade. The bread held up, because the bread had always been the whole point, and holding up was the one thing Adam knew how to make it do. Other programs called. Marcus Reed, who had built a career on finding the good thing before anyone else, took a certain proprietary pride in having found this one and sent others along. And the small shop with the crooked door became one of the names people traded when they talked about where the real thing was still being made by hand. Helen Foster recovered enough to keep the promise she had made from her hospital bed, which was to be well enough to taste it. Adam drove her out to Fuller Street on a slow Sunday and stood her in the center of the floor where the butcher paper had once blacked out the windows, and watched his mother eat the bread her son had bet everything to make. And it settled on him that the arithmetic he had run a dozen times in his truck, the arithmetic that had never once come out reassuring, had somehow, against every number, come out right. He thought sometimes about the door at Harron Foods and the sound it had made closing at his back, and found he had stopped feeling anything sharp when he did. A door had been shut on him by someone who saw him as a row on a report. And he had spent his last dollar and his last reserve of nerve prying open a different door, one with his own name on the glass and his own bread in the window. And that second door had turned out to be the only one that had ever truly been his to open. Sometimes the door another person slams in your face is the very thing that forces you to build the one that was meant to be yours all along. Lasting success does not come from other people's applause. It does not come from the moment your worst enemy is proven wrong. It comes from the plain, unglamorous courage to chase the thing you love, and from the harder courage to stand back up, one sleepless night at a time, after everything you had has been taken away.